Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for taking time to join us for this informational webinar about the California Documentary Project deadline for this year, which is November 2nd, 2020. We're going to be spending about an hour, hour and a half here taking your questions and making a presentation about what it means to apply, our guidelines, our eligibility requirements, and much else. So stay on the line. We're just going to review some techniques for using GoToWebinar now.
First.
Okay, well, my name is Kirsten Vega. I'm the program assistant in the Oakland office of California Humanities, and with me today are my colleagues, John Lightfoot. John, do you want to say hello?
Hi, sure. I'm John Lightfoot, Senior Program Officer.
And Deborah White.
Hi, I'm Deborah, Grants Manager with California Humanities, Oakland office.
Great. And we did have a really high turnout for this webinar, so we were interested to hear how you heard about the webinar. We're just going to launch a little poll, and if you could let us know how you heard about this, that would be wonderful. Okay. Looks like a lot of e-news, word of mouth, and social media mentions. Thanks. So if you haven't used GoToMeeting before, you'll see there's a control panel on your right. You can open and close this panel with the orange arrow. Unless you're on a MacBook, we usually recommend you use the phone call feature, and we've put the number in the upper right-hand corner of the first few slides today in case you need to dial in. If you have questions about the CDP program, you can certainly type them into our question box. We're going to be answering some of them in written format, and some of them we'll cherry pick and answer verbally at the question breaks. We'll have a few of those today. I'm guessing that many of your questions might be answered in the slideshow that we're going to present, but if you have a highly specific situation, a question about your own eligibility or your project, you can always reach out to us by email after, and we'll have John Lightfoot's contact and Deborah's contact at the end of the show. And then the guidelines and FAQs, which we're mentioning, I don't know that they're here in the panel, but they're certainly on our website, and we'll email them out to you along with a recording of this webinar if you can't stay. Thanks. And now it's over to you, John.
All right, thank you, Kirsten. Welcome, everyone. Again, I'm John Lightfoot, Senior Program Officer at California Humanities, and I've been managing this California Documentary Project grant program for a number of years now. And what we want to do in this webinar is a few things, starting with the agenda and our goals. It's really to provide an orientation to this organization, California Humanities, who we are, where we're coming from, what our priorities are, and what some of our activities are in addition to the CDP, or California Documentary Project Grant. Obviously, the bulk of this webinar is going to be focused on talking about how you can apply to CDP, and really to address some of the most common questions that we see. The goal isn't necessarily to go over the guidelines in minute detail because they're fairly thorough already. Hopefully people have reviewed them in advance. And we spend a lot of time and energy making sure that we can sort of, anticipate and answer any questions you have in advance. So either in the guidelines or the FAQs, there's a lot of information. So please refer to them first. And if you don't find your question answered there, feel free to be in touch. And then ultimately, we want folks to be able to submit the most competitive application and proposal as possible. I mean, we want to support high quality, really strong work, and we want you to be able to access these funds if your project is a good fit with this grant program. So that's the other main goal, is just for help you decide whether this is a good reasonable fit for you. It's not to turn anybody away or discourage anyone, but it's really just to assess whether it makes sense to apply to this or not.
Excuse me, John.
Yes.
You may want to go back to show the call-in number. There are a few people saying that they don't have the audio.
Okay. Audio is there. I'll leave it on the screen just for a minute or two. Thank you, Deborah, for letting me know. hopefully that will resolve it. And what I'd suggest is if people do have difficulties, maybe Deborah or Kirsten can add that information if you haven't already to send that out to everybody, if that's an option. Okay. So I jumped ahead to the agenda here, but I want to say that I really want to emphasize that the bulk of this, or the primary focus of this webinar, is to answer your questions. And to Kirsten's point earlier, because it's a large group, questions will be asked in writing, and we'll respond to them as we can. And just to reiterate, if there's something that's really specific to your project, it might be best to follow up with us offline, because we can really stick to questions that are of general interest here. Webinar is recorded. It will be made available to everyone after the fact. To go back a slide, just want to make sure everyone's aware, as I'm sure you are because you've seen the guidelines, but just to go over the basic contours of what the California Documentary Project Grant looks like. So this is a competitive grant program, longstanding grant program for California Humanities. It supports film, audio, and interactive media projects that explore and uncover California subjects and issues, and use the humanities to provide context, depth, and perspective, and have the potential to reach and engage statewide and national audiences through multiple means. We're really looking to support projects that are accessible to the audiences that you've identified as the audiences you want to reach. And then, in terms of format, we always like to say this, get this up the front because we're asked this a lot. Shorts, podcasts, features, series, virtual reality, we've supported all those modalities and all those styles and platforms. And so we're really open to the right project for the right audience, regardless of what medium it is. As with prior years, we have research and development grants up to $10,000 and production grants up to $50,000. The thing to know about the production grants, however, is that they are most people apply for the full amount, but you're not necessarily guaranteed to get the full amount. Those grants tend to range between $50,000 and $20,000 based on the results and the outcomes of a fairly lengthy and thorough review process. And we'll discuss that more in a little bit. And of course, just to reiterate, the deadline is November 2nd, 5 p.m. Okay, so for those of you who have not seen or gone to the guidelines yet, you would go to the California Documentary Project site on the calhum.org webpage or website, and under funding opportunities, you'll see what's available. And since it's important to always know where a funder is coming from and what our priorities are, let me talk a little bit about California Humanities, and then Kirsten will talk about some of the programs we have. So we're an independent nonprofit and a state partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Our mandate is to serve the state of California. However, we're not a California state agency. It's important to note that. We've been supporting, producing, and programming public humanities activities, events, and projects around the state of California since 1975. And we do that through multiple means, such as partnering with cultural institutions or public libraries or VA hospitals, and through grant making. And the grant making is a primary focus of the organization, but we also do a lot of our own programming in addition to those partnerships. And Kirsten, perhaps you could just run through the list of some of the other opportunities with California Humanities.
Definitely. So another major program at California Humanities is Humanities for All. It's a grant program that supports locally initiated public humanities projects. Formats we've funded in the past include community dialogues, reading and film discussion groups, oral history, nonfiction writing workshop, and now many virtual programs and discussion groups. So we have a quick grant, which is between $1,000 and $5,000, and a project grant, which is funded at the $10,000 to $20,000 level and tends to take place on about a 2-year time scale. Our next deadline for quick grant is October 19th, and then we have a deadline for project grant on February 1st of 2021. California 2020 is a program that John Lightfoot also manages. It's a really interesting program that partners with community colleges across the state of California to talk about democracy and journalism. Another offering we have is Library Innovation Lab. It's a 9-month professional development program that helps public librarians diversify their programming to include first-generation Americans and immigrants. That's currently undergoing in a virtual format, but we'll have another round of applications opening in January. We also have a program known as Literature in Medicine. It's a nationally recognized humanities-based professional development program for healthcare workers. And what it does is it engages clinical staff in conversations around humanities books with humanities scholars that center around the patient experience. And our latest site is the Kaiser Permanente Sunset in Los Angeles. And then lastly, we have a program called The Art of Storytelling. It's an exhibit series that usually is based in our Oakland office, but has now moved virtual. And it talks about multi-generational storytelling projects through visual media. Thanks, John.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I want to, I guess, highlight one point, because this is a question we hear often, and that's about the difference between the California Documentary Project and the Humanities for All grant programs. And there's definitely a little bit of overlap between them or among them, but the main, if somebody's trying to decide which is the right program to apply to, the main, in a nutshell, the main difference is if your primary intention and endeavor is to produce media, the California Documentary Project is probably the way to look. If the idea is to be using media, or media is part of a component or an aspect of your public humanities programming, then Humanities for All is probably the direction to look. But we can address questions about that as we go along. All right, so again, the funding opportunities drop-down menu will give you the links to the various grant opportunities with California Humanities. And this, of course, is the California Documentary Project page. And I want to talk a little bit about the sort of how we think about media and our grant making, but also as a public humanities organization. So this organization has pretty much supported documentary media since it was founded in the 70s. And the rationale there was, this is one way that a fairly small organization can reach and serve a state the size of California with humanities content. And that's by tapping into those pre-existing networks of whether it's public broadcasting or film festivals and radio broadcasts and things like that. Despite this, 45-year history of supporting media, it's really important to stress, though, that we are not a media organization. We are, again, a public humanities organization. So our focus, our emphasis, our primary concern is on the content of the media projects you're producing. The stories you're telling, how you're telling them, how you're informing yourself about telling those stories, context, and also what audiences may take away from it. Yes, we absolutely want to support creatively made, beautiful, well-produced projects for sure. But again, our emphasis is on the story and the content you are exploring. So again, important point to keep in mind. This grant program, as I say, has been around since 2003, and I just want to show you the last few years so you just get a sense of what the kind of what the competition looks like or what the competitiveness looks like. The numbers have sort of fluctuated a bit, but they continue to climb. And as our budget changes each year we can't always predict how much money we'll have to allocate to this. But as you see, last year we were able to make $420,000 worth of grants, which is just about 8% of that $5.3 million request. But again, it gives you a good sense of what the overall scope looks like. I would encourage anybody who's considering to apply for this grant program to take a good look at projects that have been supported over the past few years. This is a screenshot of a handful of last year's projects. And you'll get a sense of the range. There's historical projects, there are contemporary projects, there are, again, dealing with multiple or a broad range of subject matters in a bunch of different modalities. Podcast series, virtual reality series, and of course production and R&D. So again, read through those and you'll get a good sense of particularly what last round looked like, but also just how we are hoping to support a range of projects that are dealing with timely issues, but then also maybe dealing with arts and cultural things that have less urgency, but are just as meaningful and resonant and important as others. Okay, so something we've recently started doing in these webinars, because we tend to throw a lot of information out and we have a lot of terms in our guidelines that you may or may not be familiar with. We wanted to go through and just define some of these as they relate to our grant-making programs. And some of these are, common terms that any philanthropic organization will have. Others are kind of unique to us. So Deborah and I are going to walk through these, and these will just be snapshots because many of these will be covered later on in more depth. But this is just to get everybody on the sort of same page to begin with. So the first term I want to address is project director. And we ask each applicant to identify, or each application to identify the project director for what's being proposed to us. And in this case, with CDP, in 9 out of 10 cases, these folks are the person with the primary sort of creative and administrative oversight for the project. And I know it's never, or it's often not quite as clean cut as that, particularly if it's a collaborative project, or if I don't know, you're in a situation where you're in an academic situation and a faculty person has to be the project director due to the arrangements with the university, but they may not be the primary creative person. So there are exceptions to this, but more often than not, the project director is the person with creative oversight. This is also, as I said, the primary administrative contact for us. So whoever you list will be who we are communicating with primarily. If it's a collaborative project, you're obviously welcome to explain that in your proposal narrative. And then also when we publicize the grant, we're often able to list both people if it's, if it's a two-person collaboration. But again, this is the sort of primary contact for us. We require you to have humanities advisors involved with your project. And we'll go over this in much more depth later on, but basically these are folks who can bring to bear their knowledge, their perspectives to inform you in the production of whatever project it is you're producing. They don't have to be in the piece, but they need to be involved in it to the degree where they are a sounding board, they are a resource for you. Again, we'll talk about that more in a bit. And then finally, for me anyway, matching funds. So we do require that any funds you receive from California Humanities allocate and expend at least a 1-to-1 match of cash or in-kind donations on the project during the grant period and during the grant period only. So if you request $50,000 for us, you need to put at least another $50,000 into the project of cash or in-kind donations. Again, we'll talk about this more in a bit. And this is, and Deborah can elaborate on this, but this is per our relationship and our relationship with the National Endowment for the Humanities, who requires us to in turn match the funds we receive from them.
Okay. So these next 3 terms sort of go together because they are about the applicant organization. And as we go further into the webinar, you'll get more of an idea if you're not familiar with them, but we are taking the time to give the California Humanities spin on what we mean. So authorizing official. The authorizing official is the person at the applicant organization who has signature authority to commit the organization into a contractual relationship. So the authorizing official should be someone who could sign your grant agreement, for instance, if the organization is awarded a grant. Again, this is something that is determined by the organization and the organization's board, but we need to know that information so that we could craft, like I said, a grant agreement. Fiscal sponsor. So fiscal sponsor would be the applicant organization if a person or an entity does not have a tax-exempt status, and the fiscal sponsor would be the organization that does have the that does have the tax-exempt status and would be the applicant org for us, and the fiscal sponsor and the entity or project or person that is doing the film would have a contract between the project and the fiscal sponsor. And that is often referred to as an MOU or Memorandum of Understanding. And the subrecipient would be the group or project that's actually doing the film. So the subrecipient and the fiscal sponsor have a contractual relationship, and the fiscal sponsor receives and does the administrative part, receives the money and does the administration of the grant, and the subrecipient would be the group or entity that is actually doing the work of the project.
Great, thank you. Now on to who can apply.
Okay, that is me as well. And so this is where you'll see how that fiscal sponsor and subrecipient might come into play for you. We accept applications from nonprofit organizations and local and state government entities. That includes public universities, although we, for the government entities, that includes public universities, libraries, museums, cities, municipal units. Organizations must have federal tax exemption. That generally means 501c3 tax status as determined by the IRS. An eligible organization cannot have an active grant with California Humanities at the time of application, nor can the applicant have a pending application for any other grant line that we have at California Humanities. And we do have a category of organizations that have been awarded multi-application status, and this is generally for organizations that have an actual fiscal sponsorship department and staff that actually whose job it is to name those fiscal sponsor relationship agreements. And so you can find that information in the guidelines and the FAQs, or you can contact us to learn more about an organization becoming a multi-application fiscal sponsor. The organization that applies must be in good standing with California Humanities, and that means if the organization received a grant prior to this application period, that the organization has turned in all requirements and that those requirements have been reviewed and all prior grants have been closed out. Individuals cannot apply for our grants, but an individual can get a fiscal sponsor, as well as any entity that does not have federal tax exempt status can get a fiscal sponsor and apply. And here with the California Documentary Project applications, the organization or the fiscal sponsor does not have to be located in California.
Thanks. And just to reinforce that last point, that's different from our other grant making programs, so just be aware of that. The emphasis for CDP is on California subject matter, California-based subject matter, as opposed to the residency of the applicants. Thanks, Deborah. I'd go back to the fiscal sponsorship point for 1 second. That is that it takes time to get a fiscal sponsor, and so I encourage anybody who's considering applying to us to get started on that right away. So you have that in place when you apply. Okay, so CDP projects. So this is a little bit redundant perhaps from what we've already covered, but just to make sure we're really clear about this. So we support projects that are in the production and research and development stage, meaning that projects that are already entirely in post-production are not eligible. Some percentage of our funds need to go towards the generation of content, with the idea that that's when our funding can be most effective, and that we're helping you contextualize and inform the process of getting to know your subject and telling the story through the advisement of the humanities advisors. As we've already said, they need to focus on California subjects and issues. The common question is, well, how much do they need to focus on California subjects and issues? Does that need to be exclusively California? And no, it doesn't. But you need to make a case for why this is, it's got a footprint or more than a footprint. It connects directly to a California subject or issue. And we'll talk about some examples in a bit that are maybe can illustrate that. Again, use the humanities, involved advisors, and have a previously completed work to submit. So this anticipates the question of whether sort of first-time filmmakers are eligible. What you need to do is you need to make sure you have some production experience already. It doesn't have to be an extensive, award-winning feature film or anything like that, but just something to show that you've got some experience. And then it's always a good idea to partner with or to enlist a more seasoned or experienced filmmaker, radio producer, podcast producer, whatever it is, to your project team to lend confidence to reviewers that you're getting advice and mentorship from somebody with a bit more experience. Yeah, and I guess the two other points I want to add to this is first and foremost, we just want to support really great stories that are going to engage, inform, engage and inform. Really, that's the primary goal right there. And so lead with stories. That's what we're interested in this case. And then I also want to say that we don't place any limitations on subject matter. It's a pretty common question for people to ask, well, this isn't about a humanities subject. And the point about our role of the humanities, as we'll elaborate on in a bit, is that it's not so much about the subject matter, it's about how you treat and approach the subject matter. Okay, another few more technical things, and then we'll get into the proposal narrative. I mentioned our funds need to be matched one-to-one. The grant periods for the two categories are slightly different. It's 2 years for the research and development grant and 3 years for the production grant. If you finish more quickly than that, that's totally fine. You can submit your final report or well before that if that works for you. Though usually projects take that amount of time because the funding landscape is usually pretty challenging. But our funds can only be used to support project activities during the grant period. So they can't be applied retroactively, meaning you can't recoup costs that have already been applied to the project. It has to be after end of March 2021 is when our funds need to be applied to your project. Then we also place a 10% cap on indirect costs and fiscal sponsorship fees. And that has implications, particularly for proposals that are coming from academic departments, but that's our limit. And if anybody has questions about that, feel free to follow up with us offline because it's a little bit complicated. Briefly, it's important to state what we won't fund, and I'll run through this fairly quickly, but we won't support projects that what we call our institutional histories that are produced or partially funded by the institution itself. It's really hard for these projects not to look sort of self-promotional. And if one of our goals is for there to be a critical and analytical take on whatever the subject and whatever story you're telling, it's very difficult to do this. So if this is sort of a scenario that you find yourself in, you would really need a third party with some editorial distance and control to be able to tell the story itself, because we can't support and we don't want to support what are the effects of promotional fundraising projects. We can't support outright advocacy, and that doesn't mean your projects can't have a point of view and that the subjects and characters within your project can't have a point of view. But any project that is, in the way I characterize it, that's sort of starting off with a statement of saying, this is what's right, this is what's wrong, is not going to be successful with us. We want audiences to come to their own conclusions. And yeah, we can talk about that more if people have questions. Again, promotional projects we won't do because they're lacking critical analytical components. As I mentioned, projects that are already in post aren't eligible. And then we sometimes see projects that are really more in the R&D stage that are applying for the production stage. And the real difference is that you have a work in progress in place for the production grant that you don't need for the research and development. But sometimes it feels like people apply to the production because the funds are that much higher. But the production is pretty competitive, and so you project wouldn't fare very well. We want to be totally transparent in terms of how we assess and review your submissions. And we have a fairly rigorous set of review criteria where we're looking at the quality and capacity of what you're proposing to us. And this all aligns directly to what we asked for in the proposal narrative. And so I won't go through this in much detail except to highlight bullet point number 2. And this is something we introduced maybe 2 years back, with the idea that it's always been implicit that it's been the responsibility of the applicant to articulate what their relationship and access is to the subjects and participants of whatever project they're producing, particularly if it's in the case where you are not of a community or you are there's a power dynamic that needs to be addressed. And so as I say, it's always been implicit that people would address that in their proposals. So we know that you're making it an ethical and genuine and have a genuine relationship with whoever stories you're communicating. But now we want you to be overt about it, explicit about it, and tell us. As you would expect, makes a really big difference in the review process, knowing that those relationships are in place. And if they aren't in place, how you're going to go about building those relationships. More on that in a second as well. So the basic application process is about 4 stages. It's a written narrative. It's the budget using the Excel template that you can download from our website. Submitting URLs and passwords if appropriate for work samples, and then the online application form within which these items are uploaded. So they're uploads as part of the online application form. I'm going to talk about the first 3, and Deborah will talk about the 4th. Some general advice before jumping into that is that as a funder of R&D and as a funder of production, we want to support projects early in the early stages. And we're oftentimes the first funder in. And what that means is, because not everyone may have been able to invest as much into creating a work sample, or hasn't raised any funds yet, or doesn't have the personal means to do that, we want to set as level a playing field as possible. So we place a lot of emphasis on the written proposal. And so it's really important for you to think carefully about how you're describing and articulating your project, and how you anticipate how you anticipate its outcome being, meaning that, like, we may not be able to see in whatever work sample that you're providing us that you've got these great characters or whatever it might be, but we want you to describe them. And so that's a lot about, writing as creatively and with as much compelling sort of content as you would in a work sample. So don't skimp on details. Like, if you have great characters, you've got a great dramatic arc, let us know. That's really important in terms of hooking a reviewer. This 4th bullet point is one that I think is extremely important, and that is, and this comes from many years doing this, and as a former filmmaker, I know how this can happen. You get so involved and invested and excited about your subject and your subject matter that you perhaps can end up overlooking some really basic sort of connective material or explanation that the person who doesn't have that level of expertise will miss. And as a result, they may not be able to connect the dots, so to speak, in your proposal. So I always say err on the side of over-explaining, with the idea that you want to minimize any possible questions or head scratching on behalf of reviewers. So lay it all out there. Don't leave people asking questions. Obviously, leave adequate time to complete the application. Leave lots of time to submit the online application form. That's obvious common sense. But then finally, don't try to shoehorn your project if it really genuinely doesn't seem like a good fit with CDP. We are open and responsive and want to be supportive of projects that are taking new approaches and maybe more creative approaches to storytelling. So don't automatically sort of knock yourself out of contention because of that, but do feel free to be in touch with us to talk it through, and we can certainly bounce some ideas around. Okay, so to the heart of what you'll be submitting to us is really the proposal narrative. And this is where you're going to describe your project to the best degree possible based on the state of development that it's currently in. We ask for a 100-word synopsis and the anticipated length of the project. The thing about the synopsis is that it should be less a sales pitch than an actual description. You want to have reviewers say, oh, all right, I get the general gist of this based on that synopsis. It doesn't necessarily need to oversell. In the story, issues, and characters, this is the heart. This is where you want to, think really carefully about how you're conveying and communicating the direction you anticipate the project heading. We know you may not have all those pieces in place. That's totally fine. But you want to gesture, or sort of, it's more than gesture. You want to say, this is the process through which we're going to, figure out how to tell this story if you don't have all those pieces in place already. And then as a project status and estimated completion date. I mentioned this relationship to subjects and participants already, but let's go into that just a little bit more. So we want you to articulate, what your access is to the subject and our community. What's your position as it relates to them? How are you going to address their needs and interests? And will there be a role that, say, your characters can play in the project? or the community can play in the project when it's done. Can they participate in screenings and discussions? Can they be the ones who, when the film, hopefully when we get back to this, when the film goes on tour and screens all around California, can they be the ones that go with it, with you, the filmmaker, or just on their own? We've had some really good examples of projects where the main characters have traveled with the film, and it's been really rewarding for audiences. So again, what's in it for them is a really important point to consider. We asked for a brief creative approach explanation, so a brief treatment. How are you going to tell the story? And in a very general, broad sense, describe the style, structure, content, interactive elements as appropriate or as applicable. You do not have to get too technical here. Somebody who's more accustomed to writing for, more dedicated film and media funders might have a more robust treatment already in place. I recommend that you scale that back to where it's sort of the broad strokes approach. This is a cinema verite project, or this is a, I don't know, nonlinear, this, that, or the other thing, or it's a virtual reality piece or something like that. Explain it, but you don't need to go shot by shot. The humanities section, as you'd expect, is important, and we'll spend a little time on this because it's important and it's a little tricky to explain, and if it's not in someone's sort of background, it's again, it may seem a little bit foreign. But we want you to explain how the humanities are going to inform your project, and we see the humanities coming into play in 3 different ways. The first being, the content itself. I mean, what the content that's evident in the piece itself, and that, well, I'll leave it at that. The content that's in the piece itself, the information you're using to inform yourself about producing the project, and then finally what the audiences can take away from it. And for people who aren't familiar with the humanities, it's worth noting that, when most people think of the humanities, they think about the academic disciplines of history and philosophy and, ethnic studies, ethnomusicology, whatever it might be. And those are absolutely appropriate and totally right, and it's a starting point. But we're actually wondering, what we want to ask is how that content and that level of study and scholarship is going to be used to inform the project. And so with the content that's in the piece itself, you're in effect generating new humanities content when you're producing these projects. And the most obvious example of how it's within the piece itself is when it's explicit, and say you've got a scholar or an academic who's interviewed and is in the piece providing context. So that's very, very obvious. Less obvious would be what's sort of implied. And so what are the questions you're leaving audience members with or listeners with that will cause them to reflect on, history, culture, whatever it might be, so that they're making the connections themselves. The third is what the audience, that's what the audiences will take away from it. How you work with it in terms of what your project, in terms of informing your project, is with humanities advisors and oftentimes with a research strategy. So we require 2 advisors for both R&D and production grants. We ask you to describe their role and involvement. And we have 3 basic categories. They're academic scholars, independent advisors, or culture bearers. And academic scholars are, just as it sounds like, folks affiliated with colleges and universities, more often than not in a humanities discipline, but doesn't always have to be. I think you can explain why somebody is the right advisor, even if they're not in a humanities discipline, if they're advising from a social, cultural, historical perspective. Independent advisors can be journalists, they can be curators, they can be individuals who maybe aren't affiliated with a college and university, but have studied a subject enough to be able to provide good perspective and broaden your perspective when making the project. And the third category are culture bearers, meaning people who, through their lived experience, have a perspective and a knowledge that one really couldn't gain through a formal course of study. So these are community members. These are people who, again, have lived the experience and have a perspective that will be beneficial to you in either accessing a community or understanding a community. How you work with them is, there's a broad range of how you work with them. I'd say the first way, and the most maybe immediate way, is to have them participate and advise and perhaps review your proposals. So they can review the humanities section, how you're talking about the humanities. And then later on, they can be consultants when you say you're doing a verite project and you're going out to do your first shoot or first audio recording, and you might want to bounce some ideas off them and say, what should I be thinking about when I talk with this person about such and such a subject? There should be resources. And then some grantees have convened them, and it's been really great to bring people together who really care about the subject, and that's one method. And then finally, when the project is done, they can kind of be your champions. They can kind of be your cheerleaders, and they can help the project get to audiences. They can participate in screening and discussions, or presentations. Yeah, they're just really good allies. And I think it's really important to see people taking advantage of that knowledge and expertise in a meaningful way. And I think really reflecting that in the proposal itself is extremely important too. You really want to show that there's already an established relationship and that it is that's meaningful. Sample work. Post-production R&D, we ask that you submit a previously completed work, the URL with URL and passwords. Production grants, you need to have a work in progress. As I've already said, it doesn't need to be, the emphasis on the written proposal, so it doesn't need to be highly refined. It needs to be something that demonstrates your take or how you're going to approach telling the story you're proposing. So if there's a character who's really central, it's really great to see something of that character. If there's some dramatic tension, it's great to see some of that. We understand, repeating myself here, but we understand that not every project's going to have been able to invest all that much time and money into making these works in progress. So we're open to what you can submit. We ask for a recommended 10 minutes, but that's a recommendation. I instruct reviewers to certainly watch or listen to that 10 minutes, but if you submit more and they're really engaged, that's great. If you submit less and it really powerful and evocative and again demonstrates or sort of illustrates what you've written in the proposal, that's great. That can work fine too. It is important to emphasize what the project director's role is in it, however, because sometimes there's a little disconnect there, and I think you just want to, it's one of those questions you want to anticipate so that people don't ask questions about, like, if you were the, I don't know, were in a major role in what was submitted, that could cause some skepticism, I suppose. And okay, so going over the major topics here, and we're going to stop for questions in just a second. But another main component is the budget and budget narrative. We have templates available on the website, as I've said, 2 different budgets, one for R&D and one for production. Research and development budget, we do ask for budget narrative because the form itself is much less comprehensive. We mentioned the one-to-one match. An important note here that we didn't mention earlier is that only non-federal sources are eligible as a match. And again, expenses after the beginning of the grant period can be eligible as the match. So to the non-federal, that means NEA, NEH, programs like that, unfortunately, cannot be used to match our funds. And then the rest of the narrative asks for brief information about all these topics here: project personnel, goals and impact, audience and public engagement, fundraising strategy, the applicant organization, and a timeline. These are all fairly self-explanatory, but I want to highlight 2 of these. That is the goals and impact and the audience and public engagement. For goals and impact, there are 2 things to emphasize. One is there are some specific outcomes that you want to list, and for the R&D grant, that could be, I want to research this subject, or I want to do preliminary interviews with these people, or I want to write a script, or whatever it might be. Those are concrete and specific. But then there are also the bigger goals that are more aspirational, saying, I want to change the narrative about such and such a subject. I want to inform people about, example I keep coming back to, and I'm thinking about where we are in California right now is this idea of climate migration, right? How can people better understand what's going on environmentally in California and its impacts on communities and individuals? So those are bigger picture goals. So you want to try to find a balance between the both. And then audience and public engagement is, as you all probably know, extremely important. We want to know who your target audiences are and how you plan to reach them. And then above and beyond that, we want to know who, thinking of audiences as tiers or concentric circles, there's always going to be an audience that is invested in your project. Everyone from your family to the community of stories being, who are sharing their stories, things like that. But how do you reach beyond that to interest somebody in another part of the country, or somebody who maybe doesn't have the same knowledge and understanding of the subject? What's going to draw them in? And we'd love to see you These don't have to be in place yet. They don't have to be concrete, but we'd love to see how you're thinking about reaching that next tier of audience through things like partnerships and broadcast and distribution and things like that. It's very important. I should mention that as an organization, over the years, we've kind of refined what we see as our priorities. And we definitely want to see projects that reach mass audiences through broadcast and at film festivals and podcast distribution and things like that. But we're really, really interested in projects that can reach atypical audiences for documentary media. So whether it's community screenings around California, whether it's getting it into educational settings, whether it's again reaching communities who wouldn't normally have access to the film festival circuit or even Netflix and HBO or even public broadcasting. Can you take the film to public libraries and rural communities, things like that? That's what gets us excited. I'll leave it at that for now. Let's take a break for questions because that's a whole lot of information at once. And I'll take a little pause and maybe Kristen can read out the questions for us. Thank you.
Hey, John. So I've been monitoring the chat, and some of the themes that are coming up are, does my story need to be entirely focused on California? Does the whole storyboard need to take place in California? Can you elaborate?
Sure. Good question. So no, it doesn't. But you need to make a case for why the California portion of it is substantive and relevant enough to warrant this being considered to some degree a California story. So the example I'll use is the series that was just broadcast over the summer, The Asian Americans, that we supported. And this is obviously a national story, but there's a very strong California component to it. And that's what they communicated. The applicants communicated in their proposal, and it's absolutely convincing and effective. There are other projects that maybe have a little less grounded in California, but speak to a California ethos or a California idea. And many projects that are looking at the role of popular media have been successful over the years. So Disclosure is a project we supported, which is looking at the representation of trans people in Hollywood. And while it's not necessarily taking place on the ground, it's looking at an industry that is firmly grounded in California. So there's always room to make a case, though consider carefully if you're how strong your case is, I guess.
Great. We also have a few people hoping for a little more information on the matching requirement. Specifically, do they need to have their match in hand when they apply? And can you meet your match through in-kind donations and services?
Yes, so the match does not need to be in place when you apply. You need to tell us where you anticipate that coming from, really with the emphasis on the word anticipate, because we know it's not guaranteed. But so that could be other funding sources, it could be other funding sources, or it could be that in-kind donation. And that's based on goods and services that are donated to the project, and you assign what the fair market value is for that. And some examples of that could be if somebody has a commercial, you got a cinematographer working for you, and they have a commercial rate and an independent rate, then that difference can be applied as an in-kind matching donation. Or if you own your own editing system, you can in effect rent that back to the project. So there are many ways to apply in-kind donations, and they add up fairly quickly. I will say in my 13-year experience, there's never been a project that hasn't far surpassed matching our funds far more than 1-to-1. Generally, these are big budget projects, not across the board, but generally. And what we hope our funding can do, and there's kind of a lot of evidence of it, is that it can help leverage other funds down the road. Because this is a fairly rigorous process, and with a California Humanities sort of seal of approval, it can help open some other doors down the road.
Great. We also have on the line, it sounds like a lot of podcasters and radio producers, as well as people who are developing video series online. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the other formats that we're able to support beyond just documentary film.
Absolutely. So yeah, so we've, web-based and audio-based projects have been part of this CDP grant for many years, and we do fund proportionally to what we receive. So the bulk of grants are to film projects, but we're absolutely supportive and extremely enthusiastic about all the other platforms. Podcasts, there's a few things going on that are slightly different with podcasts, but it's changing. But previously, there was less of a sort of distribution mechanism, and obviously that's changed. But I think one of the key things about podcasts that you want to do is you want to be really clear about how you're going to get it out to the world and what those networks are going to tap into and who the audiences are. Yeah, and same thing with the funding models. There aren't as many as there are for the film in the film world. Again, that's changing, but you just want to be really clear about the funding sources. And web series, absolutely. We're open to all of the above. It's the right project for the right audience on the right platform. That's kind of the main goal.
Great. There have also been a couple questions from people who have a project that's in active production or in the finishing stage, and they're wondering if it's appropriate to apply for a production grant if they're almost finished with production.
So the response to that is your budget needs to show some allocation of California Humanities grant funds to what would typically be considered the production stage or production activities. You, of course, can't know what's going to happen between the time you apply in November and when you find out about the grant in 2021. So I always encourage people to apply with a genuine impression of where the project is at that point and how you anticipate it sort of faring over the next few months. One of the things that happens often, actually, on occasion, is people say, I'm in the really late stages and I could finish this project based on the budget I have. But if I received your funds, I'd do this, that, these other production activities because I haven't been able to based on the funds that I have on hand right now. So that's a little bit of a no man's land or limbo between submission of the proposal and the review. But again, just apply with where the project is genuinely with your budget reflecting some production expenses post March 2021.
Great. We've also had a number of questions about whether it's possible to submit multiple applications, say to apply to both R&D and production simultaneously, or to production and a quick grant simultaneously.
Yeah, so to Deborah's points earlier, no. Let me just give some of the details on this, and this might be a little bit technical. But our desire is to get our grant funds to as many people in many regions, as many organizations throughout the state of California as possible. So we limit a grant to any organization or project director, limits to one grant for any organization or project director at a time across any of our grant programs. And that also means any applications that are pending or under review. So you as an individual project director can only have one open or received grant with us at any time. Open or under review grant with us at any time. Same thing with the applicant organization, unless, as Deborah described, it is a multi-application fiscal sponsor, meaning it's gone through a process with us whereby it's been vetted and has an established fiscal sponsorship program. You can follow up with us offline about that process if that seems of interest to you. It does take some time, so it's a good thing to get on. But just quick answer, to reiterate response, nope, you got to choose where you apply and stick with it.
Great. Well, maybe we can just move along then and then circle back next time.
Okay, thanks, Christian. Gotta remove my camera.
Okay, now we're going to talk about how to apply. And notice that the application form is up top now, and as opposed to before, it was on the bottom. We do encourage you to go onto the grant portal and make sure you establish your account as soon as possible, so that you don't run into technical problems on November 2nd. This is a machine, and so be aware that machines can cut you off at 5 p.m. as opposed to people. But go ahead. We encourage you to, as soon as this is over, if you do not have an account on the grant portal, to start to register and get that account established. Also want to point out that we encourage you to use Chrome as your browser, especially if you're using a Mac. We found that Chrome and PCs work best, but if you're using a Mac, Safari tends not to show everything that is there. So we encourage you to download Chrome, and this again is part of a reason that you would want to go ahead and get online as quickly as possible. And once you're online, you can actually download a preview of the application so you can see all of the information that we will request from the organization. And also of note and again, this is the preview and we're going to get into specifics, but also of note is that we request a signature from the authorizing official, and that particular task is actually hidden until you finish all of your other tasks. So again, unless you are the authorizing official, you definitely don't want to wait until November 2nd to complete your application, because you need to make sure that that other person can access the application and review it and sign off. Okay, so now we're going to go back to what the complete application consists of. That's the online form, the proposal narrative, the budget form using the Excel template that is included in the guidelines as well as on the grant portal, and then the links to your work samples. Go ahead, next slide. Okay, here you see, this is where we separate. The R&D application is different from the production application. And so when you start new applications, you want to use these links. Also to note that you do not have to complete the entire application in one sitting. So that again is a reason to go in and go ahead and get started and look at the application and all of its components so that you can see everything that you will need to provide to us. Okay, and so if you don't have that link readily available, you see that you can go onto the California Humanities website at calhum.org, and there's actually a button there that will take you into the grant portal. And once you have logged onto the grant portal, it remembers where you are so that when you log in at a different time, that it takes you to where you need to continue. So that's why there's that other link took you to starting a new application, but just going to the grant portal once you've started your application is a great thing. So when you open up for the application, you will see that it has apply. I want to point out that in the border here, you see there are a couple of things. There's the programs page, and there is the My Application page. When you log in, this is after you've started your application, it's always going to actually start on the My Applications page. But if you want to go in and see the other programs, you can go to the Programs page. And you're going to hit the apply button. Once you hit the apply button, then you'll see what applications you have started. And obviously your first time in, you're going to be starting a new application. It gives you your application ID. That is the AD number for research and development application, and it's going to be an AC number for production applications. Then you're going to just hit this start button, and that's going to show you all of the tasks except for the application certification task that will be hidden on your screen. But here we show you all of the tasks that you will need to complete in order for your application to be there. Here we are showing you how to add a collaborator. That is, anyone that you want to assist you with the application should have their own login credentials, but the only way that they can access your application is if you add them as a collaborator. And you would use that button. And go ahead to the next slide. And so here we are giving you an example of how you upload the different files. You see that you would upload your proposal narrative and you will upload your project budget. So you want to go to attach file, and then it will ask you to browse your computer to find that file, and then it performs and lets you know what it's doing to attach the file. And once you have attached the file, it will this button will become dark green, and you can use it. And so you want to mark that as complete once you've finished. Here we're also highlighting at the top that there are 3 dots in the upper right hand corner. Whenever you see 3 dots on the grant portal, it means that there is a hidden menu. And so if you are looking to edit something, for instance, and you can't find how to edit, go ahead and hit that 3-dot menu, and edit is probably there. Good, next slide. Okay, here again, we're showing you what it looks like once you've actually uploaded that file. Now you see that it's here. Okay, next slide. All right, the application form. I also want to point out some tools that the designers of the grant portal have put in to help. So notice this circle. The circle is either completely empty, as you see with the dashed tasks that are below, but it's either completely empty, half full, or completely filled with a white check mark. So the half full shows that you have started this particular task, but not marked it as complete, the mark as complete will not let you do that unless you've completed every mandatory question, every mandatory field on the application form. And then you can see to your left where you have the full green circle with a check mark. That means that that task has been completely fulfilled and finished. So on this slide, notice that we've emphasized that you can watch the progress of your form. And so here, there's really nothing has been saved. So this is showing that it is 0% complete. But as you go in and you finish different pages, and you tell the form to save, it will show you your progress up until 100% complete. I also want to point out that on the left-hand side at the bottom, it shows you how many tasks you have completed. And so you have one of 4 tasks complete. And notice that it says 4 and not 5, because the application certification task is hidden until you complete all the 4 tasks before it. Next slide. Okay, so again, we're showing the application form and emphasizing that it is incomplete, but it has been started. So that means something has been started. So you see the half full circle. All right, and notice now we're showing you what will happen once you've completed all of your tasks. And notice that the 4th task is not completed, but notice to the side of there, it says that it is optional. And it's important to point out that you must submit. Just putting the things and uploading the things and seeing that you have 4 of 4 tasks complete, that once you hit the submit button, then it's going to bring up another screen where it says review and submit. And so that is giving you that final opportunity to make sure that you know that everything is correct, and you will hit that button. And finally, then let's go to the next screen. When you hit the review and submit button, It will give you a final task of, I shouldn't set tasks, that might be confusing, but it will show you a final submit button. And then it's only after you have hit that submit your application that you really have submitted your application. Some applicants think that just because they've uploaded everything that they're finished. And so we want to make sure that you remember your application is not submitted until you actually see submitted on screen. So until you get to the final submit your application button, please keep working. Next slide. So here it is. This shows a submitted application. And so once you've submitted that application, if you log into the system again, and go to your applications under the My Applications tab, which is actually where it will land when you log in, you should see submitted. If you don't see submitted, your application, as well as you will receive email confirmation that your application has been submitted. You can always go in and view your application. Okay. Here are some tips for preparing your proposal. Here and again, we do read these out in case we have any visually impaired people with us. So you want to utilize the FAQs. We actually request that you read the guidelines and the FAQs completely before you work on your proposal narrative. You can start your online, again, we encourage you to start your online application as soon as possible. It is open, it's there. You can begin preparing your narrative offline and then just upload it. We ask you to obtain your Zip+4. There's a link there to help you. We also ask you to obtain your legislative district, and there is a link here that will help you find that. That is dependent upon the address of not only where you expect, well, of your organization. And here, there is, if you know what the Duns and Sams, and if you don't know what that is, you would have read it in the guidelines and the FAQs. And we definitely encourage you to get that process started, because that works with the federal government. And although we will accept your application without these two numbers, we encourage you to get that process started, because if you are awarded a grant, we cannot send out any grant funds unless we have this information. And we say to allow yourself 2 hours to complete the online application form. And I'm going to again actually emphasize that you don't count on those 2 hours. People who count on those 2 hours generally need 5, because they've waited till the last 2 hours of the day on November 2nd to submit. And so we encourage you to go in and look at the application form and find out all the things that you need to gather from the applicant organization, and everything you will need for the form. Okay, next slide.
Okay, thank you, Deborah.
This is you, John.
It is, yeah. All right, thanks for that. Okay, so what happens next? You've put your application all together, you've gone through this process, and then we should be transparent about what happens next. So our review process is thorough, thoughtful, rigorous, and not exactly speedy, but not as long as some other funders. So it's a multi-stage review that involves both peers from the field, so media makers of all different backgrounds and expertise and experience, California Humanities Board, and also staff. It is important to note, though, that staff does not make the decision, right? Our role is really to help advise and make it, to advise and basically make it so that you, again, can submit the best, most competitive proposal possible, application possible. We're involved with the review, but we do not make the decisions. Ultimately, it's our California Humanities Board who approves all the funding recommendations. The review takes about 4 months. And, unless we run into issues such as we have in the past couple of years with various things outside of our control. But yeah, just be assured that, again, it is a thoughtful, thorough, and everything is reviewed by at least 2 reviewers. And if a project goes all the way to the panel stage, it can be up to about 11 reviewers. So leave it at that. So then in terms of notification, so if you're selected for funding, you will receive an announcement from us and the grant agreements and grant agreements. And then the disbursement schedule in terms of the grant funds differs a little bit depending on which category we're talking about. For the R&D grant, it's 90% of the funds you've requested upfront and 10% when you've submitted a final report closing out your project, and that final report is reviewed and approved. For the production grant, it's 50% of what you've requested upfront upon the receipt of the signed grant agreement, and obviously the Duns and Sams numbers received as well, harking back to Deborah's earlier point. And then those funds are paid 50%, 40%, and 40% after an interim report, and 10% at the project completion and the submission of the final report and the final copies of the final production. If you're not selected for funding, you also receive announcements by email, and the emails go to both the authorizing official and the project director. You do have the option for obtaining reviewer comments, and I want to emphasize that this is a process that we offer, and it's limited feedback. We're able to give you sort of the main points that came up during the review, and we definitely welcome revised applications. So I should mention too that if you're funded, it's also a good idea to get in touch and ask for what the feedback was from the review, because that can certainly help you potentially in your next applications to additional organizations. Yeah, so that's the basic process. And so I think we should break here again because we're getting close to the end, but break here for more questions.
Hey, Don. So we're getting a lot of questions about work sample. People are wondering if there's a recommended length for their work sample, if they can submit multiple samples, or if you have any tips about sample.
Sure. So the grant guidelines say a recommended 10 minutes for a work in progress. Previously completed works can be whatever length they are, but we do want them in their entirety. There's no one answer to the work sample, but we've supported projects that had a really, really strong proposal, and the work sample consisted of maybe strung together interviews without anything else. But the framing and the content was so powerful and so strong that worked fine. Others have a much more developed, trailer with beginning, middle, and end, and that's all good too. But it doesn't necessarily, a really, really, really flashy trailer or sample is not necessarily going to redeem a proposal that doesn't hold up, that isn't quite as strong. The one thing that, in our experience, that doesn't work particularly well is just sending a sizzle reel or something like a 2-minute or under 2-minute really flashy thing. That's great to submit in association with something that's got a little more substance to it and a little bit, will give reviewers more of an idea of what the tone and approach is of the project. But yeah, it's something to think about carefully. And I mean, this is stating the obvious, but always just submit your strongest work. And I think one maybe unsolicited comment is that in the review setting, those samples that sort of reach out and kind of engage and excite and interest a reviewer quickly tend to fare slightly better than ones that maybe have a slow meandering open, because in that review setting, people are looking at things oftentimes back to back. And I think you want to interest the imagination of whoever is reviewing your application as quickly as possible. I hope that answered that question.
Circling back to the topic of humanities advisors, we had a couple of people asking if their humanities advisors need to be based in California, and whether a project director could be both a humanities advisor and a project director.
Sure. So humanities advisors can be located anywhere. It's the substance and the expertise and the perspective that they bring to the project as opposed to where they're located. That said, it has occurred that people who really know, let's say you've got an academic or scholar involved as an advisor and they are somewhere in another part of the country, it has occurred that a reviewer might say, well, why didn't they talk with so-and-so who's the leading expert on climate migration at, UC Santa Cruz or something like that. If there's a local expert, and this is partially the goal of making sure that your project has the requisite California focus to it. If there's a reason to have somebody based in California as an advisor, because it helps you in making that case, it'd be a good idea too. But again, it's not mandatory that they be in California, but strategically it might make really good sense.
And a few more.
Let me do the project director and the humanities advisor. So while there's no technical rule that the project director couldn't be an advisor, I would say strategically it would serve you best to find another perspective to fulfill that role. You may know the subject through and through, you may be an expert, all that, but the benefit of having another set of eyes and ears there could really be helpful. And I think, again, we have nothing official in our language that says that can't occur, but I don't think it would serve you as well as it could if you brought on another person. Thanks.
There were a few more questions about the match and meeting the match for you and Deborah. One was, do I understand correctly that the match must begin after March 2021? And the other question is, can you donate your own labor to meet your match?
Yes to the first question. Anything after the start of the grant period, and only after the start of the grant period, be counted as a match. And then yes to the second question, but I want to be really careful about that because we are in no way, shape, or form encouraging people to self-sacrifice for these grants. We want to see you compensating yourself. We want to see you compensating humanities advisors, which is another topic we should discuss. But we want to see people paying themselves a fair rate for this, though recognizing that the personal investment that occurs for many of these projects at the beginning is common. We hope you will pay yourselves out of the grant. That said, if you've got a difference in rates, a commercial rate and an independent rate, that could potentially be counted as a match.
Great. Another theme that's coming up is some people are trying to decide whether their project is a better fit for R&D or a better fit for production. And one question that came up is there a competitive advantage to choosing one program or the other based on our funding in the past?
Sure. So again, to be totally transparent, we fund proportionally to what we receive, both in terms of medium, but also in terms of category. So if you look at what we funded over the past few years, we did 4 R&D projects last year and 12 production grants. So the bulk of what we receive are production grants. And I really think, as opposed to sort of gaming it that way, I think the thing is to really step back and look at your project and say, do I know the subject and the direction it's taking, the narrative direction it's taking well enough and have that sample work to show to make it competitive in the production category. I think that's really the best advice I can give. There's always going to be overlap. A typical follow-up question to this is like, if somebody applied for production, but they're really kind of more in the R&D stage, do we ever support them for R&D even though they applied for production? And no, we don't. Choose it wisely, and then if you wanted. Whoever's asking the question wants to follow up with me, I'm happy to sort of talk it through more to get a slightly better sense of the status of your project.
Great. And I also want to add that for those of you who would like to look at a sample proposal that's been funded in the past, or for those of you who would like to see a list of projects that we funded last year or the year before, I've put links in the chat so you can follow and take a look at those on our website. And that might be a good place to pause for today. Oh, actually, you know what, John? I'm seeing this is a question that's come up another few times since I looked at the chat. Documentary photography, still photography, is that something we can support through this program?
As part of another platform. So if the distribution model is that it's going to be part of an interactive website or it's going to be something like that, absolutely, sure. And yeah, but a still photography project that is maybe meant for installation and exhibition and things like that is not going to be competitive.
Okay, and now I'll add.
I want to say that's come up a lot over the years, and it's really a distribution question, and it's an accessibility question.
Great. And just one more mention of the Humanities for All project and quick grants. They are able to fund photography exhibits that have strong humanities interpretation and discussion modalities. So please be in touch if you're interested in learning more about that.
Is that good for questions? All right. So then we have reached the conclusion of our webinar. But of course, if there are more questions, we are available and accessible prior to the deadline. I do want to reemphasize a point that's been made a couple times already, but please don't leave your questions to us to the last minute. I mean, it happens, we know, but we want to help you to the best degree possible. And for us to be able to do that, we need some time. So without a doubt, there'll be some panicked communications, in the afternoon of November 2nd. That's to be expected, but you're welcome to follow us prior to that, or you're encouraged to follow up with us prior to that for any of these areas here. It's like in terms of the thinking about your project, in terms of the guidelines and how it fits the grant program, that would be what you're welcome to contact me. In terms of the technical online application process, it'll be Deborah, and then Kirsten's a great program great at answering general program questions, and can certainly also direct questions if you're not quite sure who to talk with. Maybe Kristen's the person to reach out to, and she can send it my way or Deborah's way or somebody else's way. All right. So with that, I'd like to thank my colleagues. Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you, Deborah, and thank you all for your questions and for attending. And good luck. I realize this is a lot of information to absorb at once, but this is recorded. You're welcome to go back and rewatch this if you'd like. And also share it with other members of your team who maybe weren't able to attend today. So again, really good luck, and we look forward to seeing your proposals.